Sarah Chen had always been different from other women in her small mountain town. At 28, she stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but her compact frame held the strength of someone who had spent years mastering martial arts. Her grandfather, a former military instructor, had taught her from the age of 7 that true strength came not from weapons, but from within. The trouble began on a cold Tuesday morning when Sarah decided to visit the local gun range. She had been carrying her licensed pistol for protection, something many residents did in their rural community, where help could be hours away. The weapon was legally registered, and she had all the proper permits. But when she arrived at the range, 3 men were already there, and they didn't seem pleased to see a woman with a gun. "Little lady, you sure you know how to handle that thing?" sneered Jake Morrison, a local troublemaker known for his aggressive behavior. His 2 friends, Rick and Tommy, laughed behind him. Sarah ignored them and set up at her usual shooting position. She had dealt with men like this before, and she knew the best response was to focus on her practice. But Jake wasn't finished. He walked over and stood uncomfortably close to Sarah, making crude comments about women and firearms. When she asked him politely to give her space, he grabbed her wrist roughly. Sarah twisted away with a quick martial arts move that left Jake stumbling backward, embarrassed and angry. The situation escalated quickly when Jake called his 2 brothers, Danny and Mike, who arrived within minutes. Now Sarah faced 5 hostile men who seemed determined to teach her a lesson about what they considered her place. The range was isolated with no other customers around, and Sarah realized she was in real danger. Things took a serious turn when Jake demanded she hand over her weapon, claiming she was too dangerous to be trusted with a gun. When Sarah refused, the men surrounded her, their intentions clearly becoming more sinister. Jake lunged forward and managed to wrestle the pistol from her holster during the struggle. "Now let's see how tough you really are," Jake said with a menacing grin, tucking her weapon into his belt. The 5 men closed in, thinking they had removed her only means of defense. But what they didn't know was that Sarah's grandfather had taught her something far more valuable than how to shoot. He had taught her that the most dangerous weapon a person could possess was their own body, properly trained and focused. Sarah took a deep breath and centered herself, just as her grandfather had taught her years ago. She could hear his voice, in her mind. "Sarah, remember, when someone takes away your tools, you become the tool." The men had no idea they had just made a terrible mistake. They thought confiscating her gun had left her helpless. Instead, they had simply forced her to rely on skills they couldn't even imagine. As the 5 men moved closer with increasing confidence, Sarah shifted into a fighting stance her grandfather would have recognized immediately. Her breathing became controlled and steady. Her muscles relaxed into readiness. She wasn't angry or scared anymore. She was focused, calm, and extremely dangerous. The real fight was about to begin, and these men had no idea what they had gotten themselves into. Jake reached out to grab her again, still grinning with false confidence. He was about to discover that taking away Sarah's weapon had been the worst decision of his life. Jake Morrison made his move first, confident that removing Sarah's gun had left her defenseless. He reached out with his right hand to grab her shoulder, expecting easy compliance from someone he saw as just another weak woman. But Sarah had spent 20 years learning to read body language and anticipate attacks. She saw Jake's move coming before he even started it. In one fluid motion, Sarah stepped to the side and caught Jake's extended arm. Using his own momentum against him, she twisted his wrist in a direction nature never intended it to go. The sickening crack of breaking bones echoed through the empty shooting range, followed immediately by Jake's scream of agony. Before he could even process what had happened, Sarah drove her knee up into his solar plexus, dropping him to the ground, gasping for air. Rick and Tommy, who had been laughing moments before, suddenly realized this wasn't going to be the easy intimidation they had planned. Rick, the larger of the 2, charged forward with his fists raised like an amateur boxer. Sarah had faced bigger opponents in her martial arts training, and size meant nothing when technique was applied correctly. She ducked under Rick's wild swing and drove her elbow up into his ribs with surgical precision. The impact cracked 2 ribs and sent Rick stumbling sideways in pain. But Sarah wasn't finished with him. She grabbed his shirt and used a judo throw her grandfather had made her practice thousands of times. Rick's 200-pound frame hit the concrete floor with a thunderous crash that left him dazed and struggling to breathe. Tommy tried to catch Sarah from behind while she was dealing with Rick, thinking he was being clever. But Sarah had learned, long ago, to maintain awareness of her surroundings at all times. She heard his footsteps and felt the air displacement as he approached. Without even looking back, she drove her elbow straight back into his stomach, then spun around and delivered a devastating palm strike to his chest that sent him flying backward into a metal cabinet. Jake's brothers, Danny and Mike, had been watching in shock as their seemingly easy victim systematically destroyed 3 grown men in less than 2 minutes. The confident grins were gone from their faces, replaced by expressions of genuine fear and disbelief. They had never seen anything like this before, and they were starting to understand they had made a terrible miscalculation. Danny tried a different approach, pulling out a knife he kept in his boot. "Stop right there, you crazy woman," he shouted, waving the blade menacingly. "I don't want to hurt you, but I will if I have to." Sarah looked at the knife with calm interest, as if she were examining an interesting insect rather than a deadly weapon. Her grandfather had taught her about knife defense when she was 16, using the philosophy that every weapon had weaknesses if you understood how they worked. A knife was dangerous in close quarters, but it made the wielder predictable. Danny held it wrong, telegraphing his inexperience with the weapon he was trying to use to threaten her. When Danny lunged forward with the knife, Sarah stepped inside his attack rather than backing away. This move surprised him completely, and, before he could adjust, Sarah had grabbed his wrist with both hands. She twisted his arm in a sharp motion that forced him to drop the knife, then continued the movement into a throw that sent Danny crashing into the same wall where his brother Tommy was still trying to get back on his feet. Mike, the last man, standing, looked around at his 4 companions writhing on the ground in various states of injury and pain. Jake was still clutching his broken wrist and struggling to breathe. Rick was holding his ribs and trying to sit up. Tommy had a bloody nose and was seeing stars. Danny was groaning against the wall with his arm hanging at an unnatural angle. Mike realized he was facing someone far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. This wasn't just some woman who happened to know a few self-defense moves. This was someone who had been trained by an expert and had turned her entire body into a weapon. The smart thing would have been to surrender, help his injured friends, and hope Sarah would let them all leave with their lives. Mike Morrison was the oldest of the 3 brothers and considered himself the smartest. Unlike his siblings, he had served briefly in the military before being discharged for disciplinary issues. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his family. He had to try something different, something that would give him an advantage over this unexpectedly dangerous woman. Instead of attacking directly like the others, Mike began circling Sarah slowly, trying to force her to divide her attention between him and his injured companions. He picked up a heavy wrench from a nearby toolbox, testing its weight in his hands. "You got lucky with these idiots," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But I'm not going to make the same mistakes they did." Sarah watched Mike's movements with the calm attention of a predator studying prey. Her grandfather had taught her that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who thought they were clever. They tended to overthink their attacks, which made them predictable, in different ways. She could see Mike was trying to use his military training, but his anger and embarrassment were clouding his judgment. Mike feinted towards Sarah's left side, then quickly reversed direction and swung the wrench at her head with surprising speed. But Sarah had been expecting exactly this kind of tactical approach. She dropped low and swept Mike's legs out from under him with a perfectly timed kick. As he fell, she caught his wrist and twisted it until he dropped the wrench, then delivered a knee strike to his ribs that left him gasping. But Mike was tougher than his companions and managed to roll away before Sarah could follow up with a finishing move. He scrambled to his feet and tried to tackle her around the waist, using his superior weight to bring her down. This was exactly the kind of situation Sarah had trained for extensively. Her grandfather had always emphasized that bigger opponents would try to use their size advantage by getting close and using their weight. Sarah let Mike grab her, then used his own momentum to throw him over her shoulder in a classic judo move. Mike hit the ground hard, but his military training had taught him how to take a fall, and he rolled back to his feet more quickly than his brothers had managed. He was hurt and breathing hard, but he wasn't finished yet. The two combatants circled each other like gladiators in an ancient arena. Mike was beginning to understand that Sarah's skills were far beyond anything he had encountered, even in the military. Every move she made was precise and economical, wasting no energy on flashy techniques or unnecessary motion. She fought like someone who had dedicated their entire life to mastering combat arts. Jake managed to get back on his feet despite his broken wrist and injured ribs. He was furious that a woman had humiliated him in front of his brothers and friends, and his rage overcame his common sense. While Sarah was focused on Mike, Jake picked up his discarded knife and tried to stab her in the back. Sarah's peripheral vision caught the movement, and she spun around just in time to avoid the blade. But now she was caught between two attackers, with Mike behind her and Jake in front, both armed and desperate. This was the kind of multiple opponent scenario her grandfather had prepared her for, but it was also the most dangerous situation she had faced so far. Jake slashed wildly with the knife, forcing Sarah to dodge backward toward Mike, who was ready with another wrench he had grabbed. Sarah found herself in a deadly triangle, with weapons coming at her from two directions and limited room to maneuver. For the first time since the fight began, she was truly in danger. But her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind once again. "When you're outnumbered, make them get in each other's way." Sarah waited for exactly the right moment, then dropped to the ground as both men attacked simultaneously. Jake's knife slash missed her completely and caught Mike across the forearm. Instead, Mike's wrench swing went over Sarah's head and struck Jake in the shoulder. While both men were reeling from accidentally injuring each other, Sarah swept Mike's legs again and simultaneously drove her fist up into Jake's wounded ribs. Both men went down hard, and this time neither was getting back up quickly. The fight was almost over, but Sarah knew the most dangerous moment was often when desperate people realized they were about to lose everything. Tommy and Rick had recovered enough to rejoin the fight, though both were moving stiffly from their injuries. Tommy's nose was still bleeding from Sarah's earlier palm strike, and Rick was favoring his left side where his ribs had been cracked. But they were both angry and humiliated, and they wanted revenge more than they wanted safety. The two men tried to coordinate their attack, with Tommy coming from Sarah's left, while Rick approached from her right. They had learned from watching their companion's failures and were trying to use teamwork to overcome her superior fighting skills. But Sarah had trained extensively against multiple opponents, and her grandfather had taught her that most people couldn't maintain coordination under pressure. As Tommy and Rick closed in, Sarah suddenly charged directly at Tommy, which surprised both men. Instead of trying to avoid them or fight defensively, she was taking the attack to them. Sarah ducked under Tommy's punch and drove her shoulder into his midsection, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the wall behind him. The impact drove the air from his lungs and left him sliding down the wall, unable to continue fighting. Rick tried to capitalize on Sarah's apparent commitment to fighting Tommy, thinking he could attack her exposed back. But Sarah had anticipated this move and was ready for it. As Rick approached, she suddenly spun around and caught his incoming punch with both hands. Using a joint lock her grandfather had taught her, she twisted Rick's arm until he was forced to his knees, crying out in pain. Jake had managed to stand again, clutching his injured shoulder where Mike had accidentally struck him with the wrench. His broken wrist was swollen and useless, but he was still holding the knife in his other hand. Desperation had replaced strategy in his thinking, and he just wanted to hurt Sarah any way he could. He lunged at her with a wild, clumsy attack that telegraphed his intentions from across the room. Sarah released Rick and turned to face Jake's charge. This time, instead of just disarming him, she decided to end his threat permanently. She caught his knife hand as it came down, then drove her knee up into his elbow joint. The sickening crack of breaking bones was followed by Jake's scream as he dropped the knife and collapsed to his knees, cradling his now destroyed arm. Mike had been trying to recover from the accidental knife wound Jake had given him, but he was still determined to salvage something from this disaster. He picked up Sarah's confiscated pistol from where Jake had dropped it and pointed it at her with shaking hands. "Stop right there," he shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite his injuries and obvious fear. "Game over. You're going to pay for what you've done to my family." But Sarah wasn't intimidated by her own weapon being pointed at her. Her grandfather had taught her that guns were tools, and like any tool, they were only as effective as the person using them. Mike was holding the pistol incorrectly. His finger wasn't properly positioned on the trigger, and his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't have hit a barn door from 10 feet away. More importantly, Sarah could see that Mike didn't really want to shoot her. He was trying to use the gun to regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely out of his hands. He wanted to scare her into submission, not commit murder. That hesitation was going to cost him dearly. Sarah began walking, slowly toward Mike, keeping her hands visible but not raised in surrender. "You don't want to do this," she said calmly. "Put the gun down and help your family. They need medical attention and this has gone far enough." Her voice was steady and reasonable, which seemed to confuse Mike even more. "Stay back," Mike warned, but his voice cracked as he said it. "I'll shoot you, I swear I will." But he was backing away from Sarah as she approached, which told her everything she needed to know about his real intentions. He was looking for a way out of this situation, not a way to make it worse. When Sarah was close enough, she moved with the lightning speed that had already defeated 4 grown men. She stepped to the side of the gun barrel, grabbed Mike's wrists, and twisted the weapon away from him in one smooth motion. Mike was so surprised by the sudden movement that he barely resisted as Sarah disarmed him and sent him stumbling backward into a chair. Now Sarah stood in the middle of the shooting range, holding her own pistol while 5 grown men lay groaning around her in various states of injury and defeat. The entire fight had lasted less than 10 minutes, but she had systematically dismantled each opponent using nothing but the skills her grandfather had taught her years ago. The weapon they had taken from her thinking it would make her helpless had been irrelevant. Her real weapons had been with her all along. Sarah looked around at the 5 men sprawled across the shooting range floor and felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Jake was cradling both his broken wrist and his shattered elbow, tears streaming down his face from the pain. Rick was still holding his cracked ribs and struggling to breathe properly. Tommy had regained consciousness but was sitting against the wall looking dazed and confused. Danny was nursing his dislocated shoulder, and Mike was bleeding from the accidental knife wound while staring at Sarah with newfound fear and respect. The immediate danger was over, but Sarah knew she had to handle the aftermath carefully. She was legally in the right to defend herself, but 5 injured men told a story that might be hard for authorities to believe. She needed witnesses and documentation to protect herself from potential legal consequences. Sarah kept her pistol ready, but not directly threatening, while she used her cell phone to call 911. "I need police and paramedics at Mountain View shooting range immediately," she told the dispatcher. "There's been an incident with multiple injuries. I was defending myself against 5 attackers and several people need medical attention." While waiting for help to arrive, Sarah made sure to preserve evidence of what had happened. She took photos of the scene with her phone, including the knife Jake had threatened her with and the wrench Mike had used as a weapon. She also made notes about the sequence of events while they were fresh in her memory. Jake tried one last attempt at intimidation, despite his obvious pain and injuries. "You're going to pay for this," he gasped between breaths. "Nobody's going to believe that one little woman took down 5 grown men. We'll tell them you attacked us first and they'll believe us over you." Sarah looked down at Jake with calm confidence. "The security cameras recorded everything," she said, pointing to the surveillance equipment mounted around the range. "Every move you made, every threat you voiced every time you escalated this situation, the evidence will speak for itself." This was actually a bluff, as Sarah wasn't certain the cameras had been recording or had audio capability. But the look of dawning horror on the men's faces told her they believed her, and more importantly, they were remembering all the incriminating things they had said and done. When the first police car arrived, Officer Janet Martinez found a scene unlike anything she had encountered in 15 years of law enforcement. 5 large men were scattered around the range in obvious pain, while a small woman stood calmly in the center holding a legally registered firearm. Sarah immediately secured her weapon and raised her hands to show she wasn't a threat to the arriving officers. "Officer, I'm Sarah Chen," she said clearly. These men attacked me and confiscated my legally registered firearm. I defended myself using martial arts training. I have documentation of my permits, and there may be security footage of the entire incident. Officer Martinez surveyed the scene with professional skepticism. She had responded to plenty of domestic disputes and bar fights, but she had never seen 5 men taken down by one woman, without the woman showing any signs of injury herself. Sarah's clothes weren't even disheveled, while the men looked like they had been hit by a truck. The paramedics arrived and began treating the injured men while Officer Martinez took statements. Jake tried to claim that Sarah had attacked them, without provocation, but his story fell apart quickly under questioning. He couldn't explain why Sarah would have attacked 5 men who were strangers to her, or why she showed no injuries if there had been a mutual fight. Rick and Tommy tried to support Jake's version of events, but their stories contradicted each other and didn't match the physical evidence. Danny was in too much pain to give a coherent statement, and Mike remained silent, apparently realizing that anything he said would only make their situation worse. The range owner, Bill Patterson, arrived after being contacted by the police. He immediately checked the security system and confirmed that everything had been recorded. "I've got 4 cameras with different angles," he told Officer Martinez. "Audio too. You'll be able to see exactly what happened and who started what." As the security footage was reviewed, the truth became undeniable. The recording showed Jake's initial harassment, the escalation when his brothers arrived, the confiscation of Sarah's weapon, and her methodical defense against 5 attackers. The audio captured their threats and crude comments, as well as Sarah's attempts to defuse the situation peacefully. Officer Martinez had seen a lot of things in her career, but watching Sarah systematically defeat 5 grown men using only her martial arts skills was something she would never forget. The woman's movements were precise, controlled, and devastatingly effective. It was like watching a master craftsperson at work, if the craft happened to be hand-to-hand combat. The security footage vindicated Sarah completely, showing clearly that she had acted in self-defense throughout the entire encounter. The 5 men were arrested on charges including assault, battery, theft of a firearm, and making terroristic threats. Jake faced additional charges for brandishing a knife and attempting to stab Sarah when her back was turned. Officer Martinez completed her report with a mixture of professional admiration and personal amazement. "In 23 years of police work, I've never seen anything like this," she told Sarah as the ambulances took the injured men to the hospital. "Those men had no idea what they were getting themselves into when they decided to mess with you." Sarah remained humble about her actions, explaining to the officer that her grandfather had been a military combat instructor who had trained her from childhood. "He always taught me that the best fight is the one you avoid," she said. "But when someone forces violence upon you, you have to be prepared to defend yourself effectively." The story of Sarah's incredible self-defense quickly spread throughout the small mountain community. Local news outlets picked up the story, and soon regional and national media were reporting on the woman who had defeated 5 attackers with her bare hands after they confiscated her weapon. Sarah found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as an example of effective self-defense and women's empowerment. Gun rights advocates praised Sarah for her responsible firearms ownership and legal carry practices. Martial arts schools saw increased enrollment as people wanted to learn the kind of skills Sarah had demonstrated. Self-defense instructors began using her story as an example of how proper training could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But Sarah was most proud of a letter she received from her grandfather, now in his 80s and living in a veterans care facility. "You honored everything I taught you," he wrote in shaky handwriting. "You stayed calm, you protected yourself, and you didn't use any more force than necessary. Most importantly, you proved that your greatest weapon was never the gun they took from you. Your greatest weapon was your mind, your training, and your spirit." The 5 men faced serious legal consequences for their actions. Jake, as the ringleader, received the harshest sentence of 3 years in prison for aggravated assault and weapons charges. His brothers and friends received shorter sentences, but all faced significant jail time and hefty fines. They also had to pay Sarah's medical expenses, though she had sustained only minor bruises during the encounter. The incident changed how the local community viewed personal safety and self-defense. The shooting range where everything happened installed additional security measures and began offering women's self-defense classes. Sarah was asked to instruct some of these classes, sharing her grandfather's teachings with a new generation of students. Sarah's story became a powerful reminder that true strength comes from within, not from external weapons or tools. While she never sought fame or recognition for her actions that day, she became an inspiration to countless people who faced their own bullies and threats. Her grandfather's lessons about discipline, training, and mental preparation had literally saved her life. Years later, Sarah would still visit the shooting range where everything happened, now peaceful and welcoming to all visitors. She would practice her marksmanship and remember the day when losing her weapon had actually saved her life. The 5 men had thought they were taking away her power when they confiscated her gun. Instead, they had forced her to rely on something far more dangerous than any firearm: a lifetime of training, an unbreakable spirit, and the wisdom of a grandfather who had prepared her for exactly this kind of moment. The incident proved that sometimes the greatest victories come not from the weapons we carry, but from the strength we carry within ourselves. Sarah had walked into that range as a woman with a gun, but she had walked out as something far more formidable: a warrior who had discovered that her greatest weapon could never be taken away from her, because it was part of who she was.